Welcome into the Big City Sports Podcast. We're going to be talking a lot of sports today. Usually that's what we do, but there's going to be more today. We have the NBA, talk about the fresh opinions of what's taken place early on to start this season. NFL, we have the Bears. They won, still keeping their hopes alive. Giants still have a shot. The Jets are not going to be picking first overall. And then we'll get into some NHL news, maybe about 5 to 10 minutes talking Blackhawks, Kirby Doc, Nylander, all that stuff. Swig, how you doing today?
I'm good, man. Still recovering from an exhausting day of sports here. A bit of a roller coaster with football and then the Knicks looking competent for a couple hours. You guys have a good Christmas?
Yeah, I did. Basically sat back, watched Alvin Kamara torch my fantasy team for 6 touchdowns. So spent it how a lot of other sports fans did, just trying to hope that they could keep their hopes alive, but he definitely destroyed them.
Yeah, those cleats were pretty fire, though. He should have had 7 touchdowns, but Sean Payton has to have a hard on for Taysom Hill. But I mean, Christmas was pretty great. We got a scoregami out of that Vikings game. So yeah, it worked out pretty well, I'd say.
Exactly. And there's also NBA on Christmas. So let's get into that real quick. The Brooklyn Nets, look, we talked about them being a good team, potentially the favorites in the East, or potentially a favorite in the East. But I think they're playing good basketball right now. I think a lot of people are saying the same thing. They look complete. We talked about their depth. They have a lot of depth on that roster. We talked about Spencer Dinwiddie, Jarrett Allen behind the stars, such as DeAndre Jordan and others. Joe Harris is there. There's a ton of depth on this team. They're winning. Durant looks good. Irving had a great game on Christmas against his old team in Boston. I think he dropped 37 points. Huge for him. And then, of course, they won on opening weekend, but then they did drop one on Sunday night. So a little bit there, but I mean, it's hard to gauge so far this year. I think health long-term is huge for them.
Oh, that's the biggest factor for the Nets. They definitely look great. I'm not going to put much stock into a loss. Every team is going to lose a game here and there. So they're 2-1. The outlook for them right now is still overwhelmingly positive, assuming that Irving and Durant are able to stay on the court. They both have looked very good to start this season, especially in the Christmas game. Close for the first half, and then the Nets just blew the Celtics, another Eastern Conference contender, right out of the water, which has to be an encouraging sign for Nets fans. We're seeing that supporting cast make an impact as well. We've hammered on Joe Harris and Dinwiddie, Karis LeVert, etc. There's just a lot of depth on the roster. I think one thing you have to look for, though, is the Nets are, I'm sure, going to play a cautious approach with their stars. We're going to see them rest players with a condensed schedule, I'm sure, to an extent. And I'm curious to see how that affects them the rest of the season.
Yeah, we talk a lot about load management on here and resting their starters down the stretch. But I mean, I think it's key to have them healthy because, I mean, you got stars coming off injuries, plus they're injury prone at this stage in their career. So it's nice to play it safe. This is going to be hard. See your head coach like Steve Nash to go in there and actually change these minutes around and learn how to gauge these players early on in the season because you don't want them to be gassed or anything. And I'm sure they'd have conversations with them saying, look, I need a day today. But sometimes they're going to want to play every single day. You know how they have that fighter dog eat dog mentality, and that's going to be hard for a first year head coach to sort of just lay back and be like, you're not playing today. You know, we got to take the long-term approach.
It is, but the NBA is such a player-driven league where I think the players are going to have a huge factor, if not just making those decisions by themselves. And another thing is that Steve Nash has Mike D'Antoni on that staff with him, and he has the experience and the wherewithal to have a better understanding as to when might be a good time to rest a player, second night of a back-to-back, after a flight back home or flight out to the West Coast or whatever the situation is. I know that Nash isn't entirely up to speed in terms of rotations and managing minutes and everything. It takes more than 3 games without much of a preseason or anything, but he's smart enough to figure it out. The Nets have some veteran coaching options on that staff. They still have Jacques Vaughn on that staff as well. So I'm sure it'll be a collaborative effort. I'm not too worried about that.
Yeah, I was one of the advocates for Jacques Vaughn actually keeping that Nets job. I loved what he did down the stretch. I mean, he had nobody on that roster. When you want to see how well a coach is, look at the team around him. Does he have the superstars, and can he win with what he has? And that's exactly what Jacques Vaughn did. So I think he's a great head coach, but I mean, of course, he's not a head coach on the roster now, but I was a big advocate for him to actually keep that job. But you're spot on about Nash. It's going to take some time. And I know this is our early season takeaways real quick. I mean, these are just a few games right away that we're trying to nitpicking at, but I mean, it's going to be something with the Nets that right now they look great. And as long as they stay healthy, I think they can have a run in them.
They absolutely could. I think the sky is the limit for the Nets in the Eastern Conference at the moment if they are able to stay healthy and develop more of a team chemistry. And so far, they're off to a good start. I don't want to try to damper expectations too much. We're 3 games in here. It's definitely been overwhelmingly positive. There's a lot of good things to look at with the shooting and the health of the stars who have made a big impact so far. That's exactly what Brooklyn Nets fans want to see. They seem to be gelling a decent amount under a first-time head coach early on. Obviously, there's going to be some peaks and valleys throughout the season, but it's an encouraging start without question.
Yeah, and let's talk about the Bulls real quick. We've seen their struggles early on in the season. Look, I understand there's no Thaddeus Young. The rotation is still up in the air right now with getting guys ready. You have Satoransky, who's been up and down a bit. Garrett Temple, who's a former Brooklyn Net. He's been up and down a bit. But, I mean, I listened to the soundbite from Billy Donovan in his interview, and he said that they lack mental toughness. I mean, look around the team. 14 of the 17 players two-way and NBA, every single 14 of those 17 have been accustomed to losing for so long that not a single player there has experience of winning. So that's huge at the NBA level. You got to get the head right. If you're not right up there, you're not going to win out there.
Well, from what I have seen from the Bulls, I mean, they don't seem to have it mentally or physically at the moment. Now, they are also with a first-time head coach with Billy Donovan, who I still like a lot. I know they're off to an 0-3 start, but we've talked about how this is going to be a player development, rebuilding type of year. We should not expect the Bulls to win a lot of games, but we should expect to see at least some internal improvement on the defensive end of the court because they've been terrible both on the interior defense and on the perimeter. We've seen the perimeter not really surprised with Kobe White and Zach LaVine struggling, but Wendell Carter's struggles on the defensive end of the court are something I wanted to point out here because he's been an absolute sieve on that end of the court. And the fact that he's actually managed to look worse than Lauri Markkanen on that end is really, really concerning here in the early going.
Yeah, Markkanen's defense definitely has a lot to be desired. I saw him play the Hawks, the first opener. I mean, it's just blow by after blow by. He has nothing to give on the defensive side. There's not a lot of winning here. The coaching staff, you brought them in. This is going to be a long-term process, and right now it's looking to be a long season. So as long as you can find consistent development, that's what I want to find out of the Bulls this year. They're not a playoff team. I want to find consistent development. Carter, it took you 1 game to come out and apologize for your effort. Be better. I mean, honestly, you got to go out there and show that you could play, or at least show fight. Don't apologize for not showing effort after the first game of the season. That should be a given. Fired up to play the first game.
You would think so. It's not just on him. He's not the only one struggling. Like I mentioned, the perimeter defense has been bad. The offense has been mediocre at best here so far. And we're starting to see some of those rotation questions answered because Chandler Hutchison hasn't been playing. Ryan Arcidiacono, that one's a little bit more expected, but he hasn't been playing either. So we're starting to see Billy Donovan shape that rotation in his kind of mold there. I think one of the bigger takeaways, though, is that Patrick Williams is starting right off the bat here. Otto Porter is healthy finally after a couple of injury-plagued years, and he's transitioning into more of a role player coming off the bench type of spot on that team. And I'm curious to see how that affects team chemistry here in the early part of the season because none of these guys have played with Williams before.
Yeah, and Porter looked good again in the Atlanta game. Of course, that was the first game of the season. I thought Porter looked good off the bench. He gives them that spark in the shooting department because I mean, there's not a lot of shooters on that team. I mean, I guess you could say Garrett Temple, but going back to the first game of the season, he wasn't really there. So, I mean, it was basically, I mean, he's the one that can come off the bench and score for you, at least when Thaddeus Young is hurt.
I think one thing we can agree on is outside of Porter, the Bulls don't really have much of a scoring punch off the bench on that second unit. I would not call Garrett Temple a three-point shooter. I mean, we could compare him to Elfrid Payton if we're looking for efficiency percentages here, but he's not that threat. He's more of a defensive type of stopper, versatile guy. We've mentioned that he fits the Bulls' new approach here. under their new regime of people who can push the pace offensively and guard multiple positions. But I am curious to see if Hutchison gets some minutes here to try to provide a spark. But there's not a ton of internal options at the moment. I think shooting is going to be an issue for the Bulls off that second unit. So I think they're going to have to get creative with the rotations, not do a full second unit as often, have one or two of the starters left on the court, and kind of do a little internal 8 or 9 man rotation that way to keep some offensive punch.
Yeah, it's not going to be Jim Boylan where he says he wants to develop a bench in Chicago. But anyway, let's talk about the Knicks real quick. What have you liked of the Knicks so far, specifically Obi Toppin? What do you think of him so far?
Well, Toppin honestly only played in the season opener for the Knicks. Unfortunately, he strained his calf in that game. He's going to be reevaluated in 7 to 10 days. Emmanuel quickly got a hip pointer in that season opener. So the Knicks are already down a handful of players here. The 2 main rookies are injured already. I mean, come on, man. The only thing I really have liked so far, I mean, quickly looked good in the first half against the Pacers on Wednesday night. The Knicks played 2 very bad second halves, especially against the Pacers and the 76ers, and then all of a sudden beat the Bucks by 20 tonight. I have no idea where that came from. I still think that the first 2 games are a lot more reflective of what the Knicks are going to do this season, but I have liked Julius Randle. He's played better than I expected to begin this year, and I especially been impressed with his passing ability. The ball has a tendency to stop with him, or defenses tend to key in on him, and he's a much better passer than he gets credit for. He has a handful of assists. I believe he had 9 in the season opener. He should have had a couple more if guys could hit open shots. So I have liked that. The intensity on the bench has definitely been there under Thibodeau, but there's still a lot of work to be desired as well, especially with the shooting.
Yeah, Julius Randle had 7 assists against the Bucks. He had 29 points and 14 rebounds. Just a dominating game for Julius Randle. So maybe this is the year he makes that step. We talked about how the Boozer Taj Gibson comparison early on, the 2 power forwards from a minute standpoint with Toppin and Randle, how Thibodeau used to do it in Chicago. But I mean, this team's going to be interesting. Alec Burks has been shooting the ball pretty well. He's been a solid weapon off the bench. And I mean, they're piecing it together. Obviously, this is still a developmental project here as well.
Well, I think one of the main storylines for the Knicks is going to be shooting all year. It's the same thing we saw last season. Now, the Knicks won against Milwaukee tonight because guys like Elfrid Payton and Frank Ntilikina and Randle all hit multiple 3-pointers. That is none of their strong suits. That's not a sustainable formula. Alec Burks is one of the, if not the only consistent shooter on that roster. He has been great to start this year. I'd still like to see more from Quickly whenever he gets back. I think Reggie Bullock at least can be a decent shooter, but overall spacing the floor is going to be an issue. There are a couple things I did notice in the first 3 games. RJ Barrett looked fantastic in the opener against the Pacers. He was efficient, made some outside shots, and then followed that up with an absolute dud in game 2, going 1 of his first 14 from the field. He turned the ball over several times. And tonight's game, he was somewhere in between. So we're still seeing a lot of that inconsistency that plagued him his whole rookie season. Elfrid Payton was an absolute nightmare in the first 2 games, and then all of a sudden scored, I think, 26 tonight. I don't know where that came from. So inconsistency has been a big theme. And another thing I've been keeping an eye on is that point guard rotation behind Payton with Quickly out. So Dennis Smith got the backup minutes in the Philadelphia game. Burks brought the ball up a few times. Ntilikina didn't play until garbage time, but Smith also got injured in the 76ers game. So Ntilikina was that first point guard off the bench tonight. It's definitely something I'm curious to see and keep an eye on how Thibodeau runs the point guard, especially once Quickly comes back.
Yeah, and one thing about the Knicks is they do have some organizational depth. You have these guys go down right away, and you still have like depth that could play multiple positions. Something the Bulls want is that versatility to play multiple positions, and that's what they have because you can have someone that can bring up the ball, whether it's Ntilikina or anyone like that could come off the bench late. I mean, if Ntilikina's getting garbage time, I mean, I think he could have a better role, I would assume, right?
Well, I would go the other way. I think it's more concerning because Thibodeau is a coach that has always prioritized defense. Ntilikina's calling card is his ability to guard multiple positions, and the fact that he was left on the bench for Dennis Smith Jr., whose defense actually looked better than I expected here to start the year. But that is not a good sign for Frank Ntilikina. If Quickly's out and he's only coming in at the end of a game that the Knicks had lost well before the final buzzer, that's not a good sign for him. He got minutes tonight and played pretty well overall, but that's only because Quickly and Dennis Smith were both injured, and he was the only healthy option at the point behind Elfrid Payton. So that's definitely something I want to keep an eye on because amazingly, Frank Ntilikina at the beginning of his fourth season is the longest tenured Knick.
Yeah, that is absolutely mind-boggling. But something else that's mind-boggling, we're going to switch over to the Chicago Bears because there for a while, I harped on here that the Bears are setting themselves up for a monumental destruction or a monumental collapse, I think I said. Well, here we are 1 week away from a playoff spot for the Chicago Bears. We both thought they'd lose out, except for the Jacksonville game. There was about a toss-up there. We thought that they would lose out. I mean, the way they were structured going down, they lost that heartbreaker with Mitch to Green Bay. They blow the game to the Lions, and then they just started turning it up. So the Bears, they're in an interesting spot now. They control their own destiny. A win versus Green Bay puts them in the playoffs. They would play the Saints, I believe, in the first game, which is a tough test. They took them to overtime in the first matchup. That was with Foles at quarterback, but it'd be interesting to see if the Bears can make a run.
Yeah, they have been a roller coaster for us to cover this year. I mean, there is still a ton of questions about their short-term and long-term futures, but they did end up not having any trouble with Jacksonville in the second half. That first half, I was like starting to think, all right, maybe my Jaguars upset pick has a shot here, but it deteriorated after that. I figured I would throw it out there. The Bears' offense has looked significantly better since Trubisky came back, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say, but it's 2020, so what the hell? Even in the last game in their losing streak, they put up 30 points and they were finally started to move the ball up and down the field a little bit more consistently. The running game has been significant improvement. We have touched on that, but in today's game here against Jacksonville, Allen Robinson was an absolute monster, kind of his revenge game in Jacksonville, and Jimmy Graham kind of turned back the clock with a vintage performance with a couple touchdowns. And I think there are still some question marks about that offensive line, and is this going to keep up if they start to face some better teams again, including Green Bay next week and whoever they might end up with if they make it to the playoffs. But at least they've been able to finally get back into a rhythm here against some lesser teams and lesser defenses, which is a great sign. We're finally seeing Nagy call more play action, which is better suited to the current skill set. And I think that's an encouraging trend.
Yeah, we talked a ton about David Montgomery on this show. I'm not going to say it again. All I'm going to say is he got 23 carries again. So huge switch in the play calling department. He went over 90 yards again. And I mean, I think that's what has been missing is a run game. I mean, the Bears haven't had a run game since Matt Forte. I guess you could argue Jordan Howard because he did a few things there. We got in the end zone and Cohen was there. But, I mean, the Bears are finally running the football. They didn't run the ball with Nick Foles, and I think that led to some of their losses. You run the ball, take the game out of Mitch's hand, and you can finally find a way to get down the field and win some football games.
I mean, are we glossing over the Jeremy Langford era already? I mean, that's a little disrespectful, but I mean, Trubisky overall has been playing some of his best football. Although one trend I still have noticed, even in this Jacksonville game, is he's turned the ball over a couple times in the red zone. And he had one at the end of the first half against Jacksonville with that interception. Now, thankfully for the Bears, this one didn't end up really costing them at all. But that is something he's going to need to clean up if the Bears are going to make any noise in the playoffs, of course. Those turnovers in the red zone are an absolute killer. But the running game has been rejuvenated, mostly, I think, like we've talked about before, because Trubisky's been reinserted as the starting quarterback. He brings that added mention to the offense. And at the same time, though, they're going to be facing much tougher tests starting in week 17. Their playoffs start. They actually already started, I would say, with the game today against Jacksonville, because if they lost that game, they'd be out, I think, even with the help they got with Arizona losing to San Francisco, which is obviously good for the Bears in terms of them making the playoffs this year. But that could very easily change, because Arizona is going to face a Rams team next week that will most likely not have Jared Goff, who I believe broke his thumb or had some sort of thumb injury in the Rams game today. And the Packers, while they looked fantastic against the Titans today, they were not able to clinch that number 1 seed mathematically today. So they're not going to be resting anybody. So Chicago is going to have to play a near perfect game to beat the Packers and clinch that spot themselves, because Arizona, while they're very inconsistent, you cannot play with under the assumption that they either are going to beat the backup quarterback or they're going to look like they did against the 49ers.
Yeah, John Wolford is going to be starting to quarterback, I believe. We don't know yet. So we're speculating here. And he has never thrown an NFL pass, but he was great. I think he was in the Alliance or the XFL. I cannot remember where he was, but he had a great run there wherever he was, right?
Yeah, he did. He was playing for the Hot Shots, I remember, which is Arizona. A fantastic name for a smaller football team. And I remember him going back to his days at Wake Forest. He definitely has a little bit more mobility than Jared Goff, if nothing else. And he's got a pretty electric arm. Now, the accuracy is going to be a question, but I do remember him. He's got at least some dynamic ability, but if he does end up starting, which seems likely, he's going to be put into one hell of a spot from the Rams' perspective. That game is going to have huge implications on the Bears, who are not guaranteed a spot. Obviously, you have Green Bay they clinched the number 1 seed. The Bears would be in a much better position, but since that's not the case, they need to take care of business here. You know that phrase, they control their own destiny. They've gotten some help here in the last couple of weeks with Arizona losing. They might get a little bit more, but that's not something you can rely on. And this Bears team still has some question marks. They are inconsistent, is a fair thing to say. I think they've been up and down all year. So they are more than capable of laying an egg, and they need to stay very focused to make sure that doesn't happen.
I want to bring up one thing about the Bears real quick, about Mitchell Trubisky and the Bears in general. Let's talk about it here real quick. The first season, Mitch Trubisky, 2017, he was a rookie, of course. That was the John Fox era. Throw it out the window. I mean, that season was lost from the start. 2018, he comes in. 12-4 record. Of course, they have the infamous double doink that gets them eliminated. Then the following season, he goes 8-8. Granted, it was the Bears team that carried him a little bit, I guess you could say. He went 8-8, and now this year, he could make the playoffs at 9-7. I've seen crazier things, but if I do that math right, if you throw out the first year, they weren't winning anyway. Trubisky would make the playoffs in 2 out of the 3 years he has been an NFL quarterback.
That is absolutely insane. I mean, because we saw some of the deterioration of Trubisky when he was playing in 2019. You saw that internal clock and the turnovers. And I still think that's something that needs to be addressed and focused on going forward, whether the Bears almost incredulously decide to keep their faith in him for a 5th season or whatever they end up doing after the year. There's still some long-term questions, but he has, to his credit, after being benched in at week 3, when the Bears are 3-0, then watching Foles go 2-5 and 7 starts before being reinserted, losing his first 2 games, and then all of a sudden turning it around, rejuvenating the offense. He's had a very interesting career arc that is a big parallel with the Matt Nagy era in Chicago. I mean, Matt Nagy's record when Trubisky starts is well above 500, and when he doesn't, it's way below 500, amazingly enough. Obviously, Trubisky's not the only factor in that, but the quarterback is the most important position on the team. And amazingly enough, he's giving the Bears their best chance to win right now. He's playing his best football at an opportune time for him. So at the very least, he's not doing what Haskins did in Washington and is botching a big opportunity, whether he ends up sticking with the Bears after the year or ending up on another team in 2021.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. So Mitch Trubisky, if he ends up performing, whether they beat the Packers or not, say he goes 225 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 pick, season over, Bears lose. They don't make the playoffs. If you're the Bears and you're offering him a contract just as a bridge starter, maybe 1-2 year contract that brings him back to Chicago, if you're Mitch Trubisky, do you have that in your heart to say, they bailed on me? Or do you take the opportunity somewhere else if there's anything else out there? Or would you just stay where you're familiar with in Chicago, even though they bailed on you?
I mean, that's the $1 million question right now. I mean, that's going to be something he has to answer, whether the Bears make it into the playoffs or not. And my counter to that would be, let's say that he does have enough pride where he doesn't want to stick in Chicago. Because they declined his 5th-year option. He was benched for a good chunk of this year. I get that. But how many teams can you look at that are going to say, okay, our quarterback situation isn't great. Our best long-term answer, or even our best short-term answer, is an upgrade with Trubisky. I don't see a lot of teams being in that mindset. You could point to one or two that might at least think about it, but I don't think he's shown enough where you can invest in him and think that he's a long-term answer. And there's only a couple teams in the league who might be in the position to want a bridge quarterback. And we've seen how that can work out a little bit with Teddy Bridgewater in Carolina. I like him a lot. He led them to a win today, earlier against Washington here. He's been solid statistically all year, but Trubisky reminds me of Teddy Bridgewater in a lot of ways. He can bring that mobility. His floor is getting a little bit higher every week, but that ceiling isn't very high. And long term, I still think Carolina is going to want to go for a franchise QB. I don't see any team in the league right now that's going to look at Trubisky and say he is the franchise quarterback answer, because I still think the Bears' ceiling is limited with him. I think the Trubisky we're seeing now is about as good as we're going to see from him. I think he still has some very clear limitations as a quarterback. So I just, if I'm offered that contract in Chicago, where even if it's just one guaranteed year, I would take it, because he's not guaranteed that opportunity anywhere else.
That's true. Opportunity should be slim for him. I mean, it depends on how far this run goes. If he, by God, if he works his way all the way to a Super Bowl title, he's definitely gonna be sticking around in Chicago. That's the biggest long shot of the year. So that's definitely not gonna happen. But if it did, I look at one more team that could give him that opportunity. What about Washington? What about Washington or Pittsburgh?
Yeah, we've kind of mentioned some of their quarterback possibilities in various episodes here, because they're so open-ended. But if Pittsburgh brings him on, I think he would be a backup to Roethlisberger next year. So I don't think Trubisky's going to want to do that unless he really gets a guarantee that he'll be the starter in Pittsburgh after he leaves. And we thought that was going to be Bridgewater's situation in New Orleans. And I don't blame him for saying, I'm getting another year older here. I'm going to go somewhere that's letting me start right now. But I just don't know if that situation is going to exist. Now, Washington, I think, if nothing else, is going to want to bring Alex Smith back. He's shown enough. We're on a 1-year deal, or if it's a short-term thing. The game manager approach that Smith has been known for his entire career. For the most part, he's not going to lose you any football games. It's kind of a similar position to the Bears in some ways, because Washington's defense is the strength of that team. You could point at the Colts if they move on from Rivers, but I mean, bringing Trubisky there, I think would be a really, really interesting fit. They basically have a bigger version of him and Jacoby Brissett anyways. So I'm really struggling here. I think the one wild card would be Denver, because Drew Lock has been pretty horrible all season. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they do to, try to fix their situation here in the short term. But the draft has a decent amount of quarterback options as well. We all know that Trevor Lawrence is going to Jacksonville now. And likely enough, I'm starting to feel more and more that Zach Wilson is going to be the QB2 because of his arm talent. He could go to the Jets. He could go to whoever trades for that second pick. Do we think the Bears trade up to number 2 again? I think that'd be pretty funny to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think people would be going nuts in Chicagoland, especially if it's Pace doing it, because I mean, his quarterback scenario has been so strange. Yeah, Ryan Pace's future could still be in doubt, but it appears Matt Nagy is coming back. I mean, that's something that has been spoken of, at least in the media so far on Sunday. So, I mean, do you like this decision? Do you think if he stays, Mitch stays, or do you think it's a breakup of everybody?
I definitely think those two could be tied together. I know at the end of the day, Trubisky is going to be more Ryan Pace's legacy as a GM. I mean, that was his definitive move, good or bad. Yeah, these GMs are tied to the quarterbacks that they acquire. But the early report here is that Matt Nagy is expected back. I think one thing going in his favor is, despite all of the dysfunction we saw in the middle of the season, this Bears team has responded with a couple of big wins when they really, really needed it. And even if the Bears do end up losing and missing the playoffs in week 17, it does show that maybe Nagy has not lost the locker room after all of this roller coaster stuff that they've been going through on and off the field, the quarterback drama, the bizarre offseason, the injuries, just the inconsistency all around. I think since Nagy is most likely coming back, I think there's a good chance that Trubisky is going to be back for at least next season, assuming he's able to swallow his pride that fifth-year option was declined on his contract. And I think he's smart enough where he would do that, unless he can find a situation that we don't foresee right now, where he's basically locked in as a starter somewhere else next year. Though right now, Nagy is finally showing the ability in terms of his play calling to adapt to his quarterback, which is something, that him and Bill Lazor, I'm sure, have been working on for a long time now, but we haven't really seen it in the last 3 years. They're finally building a system around the quarterback. I think Trubisky is, without question, the most likely guy to stick around on that roster right now, because we sure as hell know it's not going to be Nick Foles and it's not going to be Tyler Bray, who briefly showed up on that Monday night game, right? Is the Bears are most likely, even if they miss the playoffs, not going to be in the position to draft a quarterback unless they make another trade up in the draft. Yeah, they might take a flyer on somebody in the mid to late rounds, kind of like what we saw the Colts do with Jacob Eason in last year's draft. They could go for somebody like that in the third, fourth, fifth round, have him sit for a year or two as an insurance policy. But unless they make a drastic move, the Bears are going to be picking in the mid to late teens in the draft. So they could go for a developmental guy, maybe a guy like Trey Lance slips. I feel like that's a little bit more likely now with Wilson cementing himself, because if he's not the QB2 behind Lawrence, he could be the QB3 behind him in Fields. And I just don't see 4 quarterbacks going in the top 10 like they did in 2018. So the Bears' best course of action is they might want to take a flyer on a guy either later in the first round, or I think smarter, because there are still some holes on that roster, in the middle to late rounds of the draft. See if you find a diamond in the rough. And then if Trubisky does regress, you can invest a more premium asset into that position in a couple of years.
I tell you one name that I think is going to be an underrated QB prospect. That's Kyle Trask. Look at him. He's in the running for the Heisman right now. Yes, he had Kyle Pitts, but look at what he did when Kyle Pitts was out. He still put up numbers. He had Tony on the outside. But I mean, he was a quarterback. Simple as that. He was a great quarterback in college football. And I don't know how his pro day is going to look. I have a feeling he's going to be one of those where combine pro day, they start to fall in love with the arm talent and all that. He starts to climb up on the ranks. But if he can stay under the radar, I think someone could find a diamond in the rough in someone like a Kyle Trask.
And he could be a second or third or fourth round pick. I mean, the opinions are all over the place of him so far. I'll start evaluating some players here soon here once the regular season is over after next week. I think Mac Jones, if he ends up coming out, is another name to keep an eye on out of Alabama in a similar position. So the Bears at least have options, but they still have so many long-term questions to answer. They're in a precarious spot here. So you could definitely make the argument that defense is very solid, which for the most part it is. But at the same time, it's for the most part aging as well. You definitely have to question the long-term viability of some of these players. I'm not disregarding anything that they've done for the Bears, but you can definitely make the argument, could Khalil Mack start to decline? Or is that Robert Quinn contract going to look even worse, which seems likely? There are still some questions in the secondary. I like Jalen Johnson a lot. Kindle Vildor did not look great in his place today. Chark had that really nice touchdown over him. But I still think there's some questions at the safety position. Now, I know we kind of glossed over the defense in today's game. Jacksonville is not the best litmus test for any defense this year, but Roquan Smith played out of his mind today for the Bears. He is a young player who's only a few years into his career. I think he could be a long-term building block who has a huge impact on that front seven. But Akeem Hicks, as great as he is, he's a veteran player. I still think he has a couple more seasons in him, but there's questions there. The offensive line needs a lot of work. So the Bears are not, they're still in my mind kind of in that middle position where I don't think they're true Super Bowl contenders at the moment, but they're not bad enough to bottom out and go for a franchise changing talent in the draft either. And the road to the top or the bottom is not a 1-year job either way. So the Bears, whatever decisions they make, could have a really long-term impact on their future.
I found it odd the way that Ryan Pace built this team. So he drafts his quarterback and he trades for Khalil Mack. Like, yes, it's year 2 of a rookie quarterback, but if you're going all in to win, why are you doing that when you have a quarterback? I'm not putting this on Mitch Trubisky. I'm saying Trubisky, I think we could both agree, wasn't phenomenal his first year with Fox, right? He wasn't good. So I don't understand why they bought in. They signed Allen Robinson and were like, let's trade for Khalil Mack, all these picks, and throw it all on Trubisky. That's the move that I think really could define his career as a GM in Chicago.
Well, I think there's 2 factors to that. First of all, the Raiders, for some reason, made Khalil Mack available. You put a shiny piece of candy in front of a kid, they're going to take it. And frankly, I don't blame him for this one. He's a game-changing pass rusher. He's elite. I'm not trying to discredit him. He's played very well for the Bears for the most part. The other factor, though, is that maybe Pace had this in mind. At least he should. A cheat code in the NFL is building around a quarterback on a rookie contract in terms of the salary cap. Trubisky was still on his rookie deal right now, so you don't have him on a 30 or 40 million a year deal like most of these other contenders do. So I think some of the thinking was to try to build that entire roster around that. We're seeing that happen to varying success in Buffalo, for example. We've seen it before in several other places as well. So I think that was at least his line of thinking. It kind of reminded me of when the Nets, when they were still in New Jersey, traded for Vince Carter. They were going through a spot at that time where they were trying to be more of a savvy franchise in terms of pinching pennies. And then Vince Carter becomes available from Toronto. Oh, okay. We see an opportunity here. I think that's kind of what the Bears were doing when Khalil Mack was all of a sudden dangled in front of their faces. So I don't blame them for that. Trubisky is still the more important long-term question to be answered and the more long-term effect of what Ryan Pace has done as the GM. But if you're able to build a good team, and the Bears did build a good defense around a QB and a rookie deal, they went 12-4 1 year with that. I mean, you can at least see the benefits of that approach.
Yeah, and talking about approach and building a team and quarterbacks, let's talk about the Jets. They locked in the number 2 spot in the draft. A lot of question around New York. They showed fight today. Matthias Farley, I loved his pass breakup on that drive down the corner of the end zone. I don't know the receiver, nor did anyone else that was calling the game for the Browns that they were sticking on the outside there. I mean, they had any receiver out there. You didn't even know him. But anyway, Matthias Farley, huge pass breakup for them. The Jets showed some fight another week here. I think it's good. You love to see it late in the year. But what did this do to their long-term success?
Well, it cemented them into that second pick, and it's going to force them to choose one of those roads that we discussed on the last episode. But I want to reiterate that now. So Jets are officially picking second in this draft. Not great. They've exceeded my projection of 1-15 for the season now. So thanks for that. But I do think we should at least give a passing mention. They beat Cleveland in part because the Browns lost all of their wide receivers for contact tracing before the game. Not trying to take away anything. They played very hard, but I do think that had a factor. I think that's fair to say. I want to, at least talk about the game for a minute here. We saw the Jets getting creative. Jamison Crowder threw a touchdown pass and caught one. I mean, maybe the Jets should be building around him instead, huh?
I like that one. Building around Crowder. Why not? I mean, he's got a big arm. That was a great little trick play they had going there. I mean, when you're trying to win a game, I don't know why, but when you're trying to win a game, you have Crowder go out there and do something special like that.
I mean, hey, he went to Duke and he had more of a downfield presence than Daniel Jones did today, but we'll get into that later. Yeah. See what I did there? Anyway, so let's go back to the long-term thing here, because that's the main focus of what happens for the Jets. It doesn't matter what they do in week 17 now. So they have, I say, three main options. So with the second pick, do you trade out of that pick and build around Sam Darnold? I think there's definitely an argument to be made there. Do you draft Zach Wilson or Justin Fields or one of the other QBs and trade Sam Darnold? Or do you stick at number 2 and draft Penei Sewell, the offensive lineman, have him and Mekhi Becton as your two tackles long-term to protect whatever quarterback you roll with and try to build a roster around all of that? I think I think overall my thought is leaning towards they should trade out of number 2, give Darnold a shot, try to build a roster around him, because I still think if that does not work out, they'll still be in decent position to draft a QB in 2022, because Darnold still will be under contract next year regardless.
Yeah, and I think they would pick up that 5th-year option on him. I mean, that's all goes out the window if he has a bad year. But anyway, let's pop up last week's poll question because it fits into this topic real quick. Twitter poll question of the week from last week. There it is. If the Jets finish with the 2nd overall pick, what should they do? Let's see what you guys answered. 6 votes say keep the pick / trade Darnold at 33%. The bottom half say trade the pick, build with Sam at 67%. So that's the poll question of the week. It's an interesting topic because, I mean, I'm on the bottom half. I think they should trade the pick. Well, I don't know your thought process on it. I think they should trade the pick, build around Sam, recoup some of that accumulate some picks and build from there because they have a lot already. Why not get more?
I agree. I mean, I'm glad the listeners are on board with me here. But I do think that giving Darnold a fair shot getting out of Adam Gase's offense, I still assume that that's going to happen after next week here, regardless of what happens in week 17. They are starting to build an offensive line. You can make that argument that if they had Sewell and Becton, I mean, that he would be better protected, although you'd still have to address the interior of that offensive line as well. But it would be nice to see him surrounded by some more legitimate playmakers. We could see more of an impact from Denzel Mims in year 2, hopefully fully healthy. The Jets do right now have 3 picks that are going to be in the top 34. They have to address that defensive side of the ball too. Overall, I'm still on board of trading number 2, assuming you can get a legitimate return. I think they need to pay attention, look back at some of the trades for those high-end draft picks in the last few years. The most recent was in 2016, I believe, the Goff and Wentz year when the Rams and Eagles traded up to 1 and 2. We'll see if they are able to extract any sort of return like that from whatever team it is. If they can do that, I think it's the right move for them. If not, if they're not able to get fair value, I would still stick at number 2, but I would still be on board with building around Darnold, giving him some playmakers or protection. If you can get Penei Sewell right there. One question I would ask, though, is which one of him or Becton would you move to right tackle?
I'd have to watch some tape. I mean, I like Becton a lot. I think he's done a great job at left tackle. I mean, I don't know who I'd move. Becton has a full year at left tackle in the NFL, so I think I might lean him just to start out. Let Sewell play right tackle. But do you think if they stay at 2, it's automatically Penei Sewell?
That's where I'm leaning towards right now. I think that would make the most sense because even with Becton, that Jets offensive line is still porous and they still have some long-term questions regardless. If they aren't careful, Becton could turn into what Joe Thomas was in Cleveland, an all-star Hall of Fame left tackle even. I don't think that's out of the question, but on a team that's terrible pretty much your entire career, in Thomas's case, absolutely his entire career. So if they stay at number 2, thinking out loud here a little bit, if they could try to address the defensive side. They could go for a guy like Micah Parsons out of Penn State. I think number 2 would be a bit of a reach for him, but he can definitely be someone that impacts all 3 levels of a defense. And they really need some transformation on that side of the ball. There isn't the Chase Young type of pass rusher in this year's draft that's like a no-brainer guy. The closest at the moment is Gregory Rousseau out of Miami. And I still think there's some questions about him because right now, from what I've seen, he's more physical tools than production. One of my friends gave me the Ziggy Ansah comparison, and I do like that at the moment. Not saying he can't develop into a productive player, but that's a big swing willing to take that early in the draft. So if they stick at 2, I think it kind of has to be Sewell, because there's nobody else right off the top of my head besides a quarterback that would make for proper value there. So if they're not sold on him, I think they should try to trade down, get another pick in the 8 to 15 range, and maybe another second rounder as well, and then put more weapons on that field. But they also need to address the corner position. 2 would still be too high, I think, for a corner. But if they trade back down a little bit further into the middle of the round, they could get a guy like Farley or Surtain or whoever it is, and get a building block on defense too.
That's what I'm going to bring up. I got a trade proposal for you. Would you accept this from both sides? So the Jets trade down with the Falcons, who are at 4 right now. Falcons go up, get their left tackle. They've needed one for years. Keep Matt Ryan upright. And the Jets take Patrick Surtain with that pick at number 4. Would that be too high, or they end up getting their final corner?
Ooh, I mean, I lean towards that, depending on what the Falcons throw in, of course, to move up those 2 spots. And if I'm the Jets, I'm asking for a lot. I mean, even if it is 2 spots, I mean, we saw what the Bears had to give up to move up 1 spot for a quarterback. Now, the Falcons, though, they still have Matt Ryan on a very big contract at the moment. I would be surprised if they trade up to number 2 unless they find a way to move on from Matt Ryan, and that would be a really drastic move for them to take. I know they still have some questions to ask, but typically we don't see teams trade up like that into the top 3 of a draft unless they have their eyes on a QB. If I'm the Jets, knowing that they actually have the leverage here, I'd be asking for a lot. If they're able to get fair value, I would move down, and I think 4 is a reasonable spot to take a corner, but that is the highest I'd be comfortable. We saw Okudah go number 3. I still think he could be a good player for the Lions, but he has had a rough rookie season, and that might be a bit of a warning to anyone taking a corner high in this year's draft.
You also saw Jalen Ramsey show out.
We did. And going back, you could point to guys like Marshawn Lattimore, who went like 11th at the same time. And you say that you could pick up one of those guys if you trade down a little bit further than 4. It's not like that. There's not going to be the same run on a corner in the top half of the first round as there would be on a quarterback or an offensive lineman. So teams like the Falcons have a tendency to reach for defensive backs. I mean, pointing at AJ Terrell or Keanu Neal or something like that. But the Jets could trade down a little bit further into the draft, pick up Surtain. They could pick up Caleb Farley. There are several options at that position. They don't have to take one at number 4. If they do trade down, it's possible Sewell slips a little bit at the same time. Although if the Bengals do end up picking 3rd, I don't think there's any chance he falls past them.
Yeah, if the Bengals end up there. One more thing, final trade proposal. I know I don't want to bore you with these, but do you think that the Lions, you think they could trade up to 2 and maybe take Zach Wilson there? You get your corner late there. They'd have to. I would. Stafford. I mean, he's been injury riddled these last few years. He's a tough guy. I'm not putting that away from him. Back injuries, thumb injuries. He's just gotten beat up in his career, and I think they need someone to step in there.
Well, the Lions have failed Matthew Stafford. Let me say that in his defense right now. Stafford has not failed the Lions. The Lions failed him. But they are at the point where they do need to think of a successor at the quarterback position. I would like to see them do something bold like that, but I don't think off the top of my head they have the draft capital to do so, because that pick is going to have a ton of value. You have to look at a team that has a couple extra picks to work with, either in 2021 or if they picked up something in 2022 with one of these future-oriented trades. So right now, I don't think they have the capital or the resources to do that, but I do like that kind of wild card team. Them or the Falcons, a team with a veteran QB that isn't going to win them anything, most likely at the end of their careers. So I do think it's a solid wild card pick.
Yeah. Outside of that, we don't have too much else to talk about the Jets. I mean, they need a cornerback. They got the number 2 pick and they won today. So hopefully this builds towards next year, and Adam Gase is gone by the time we record our next episode. Of course, they hand out the papers out on the Monday. It's usually the Black Monday, they call it, where they're all fired and stuff. But anyway, let's talk about the New York Giants. A little more depressing here, but look, they still have a shot at a playoff. That's the only silver lining here. But they did not look good today.
No, and they haven't looked good for the last 3 weeks. And I kind of said that was coming. I mean, they went on the 4-game winning streak. That's the ceiling of what the Giants can do, though. They played Washington, who hadn't hit their stride yet to start that. They played an inconsistent Eagles team and finally got a win after choking several away. They played a Bengals team down to their backup quarterback and barely survived. And the Seattle game was kind of an exception with Colt McCoy. That was a fun one. But the Giants offense has still struggled mightily all season. It struggled again today with Daniel Jones back under center. He did okay. I mean, but the Giants defense is starting to get controlled pretty well here. The Ravens game was almost identical to what we saw out of Cleveland last week, except they just jumped right down the throat immediately instead of waiting to the second half. The Giants defense could not generate any pressure whatsoever for the second consecutive week. Bradbury being back there didn't make a huge difference. The Giants still have a lot of questions at the linebacker position. I don't have a ton to say about it. It was just not a very good game. They do have a shot to get in the playoffs with a 6-10 record, as pathetic as that is, if they beat Dallas next week and Washington loses to the Eagles. But I will believe that when I see it. And I still question if that would be better for the Giants long term, because it would drop them down to like 19th in the draft.
Yeah, if they end up getting a top, so if they lose, where would they be picking? Somewhere in the 9 margin?
Right now, they're slated to pick 8th, so I would assume that is the, unless something drastic changes with strength of schedule in the next week. I think 8th is where they would pick if they lose. They could, if a few other teams win, move as high as number 3, amazingly enough. I know that that's unlikely because Cincinnati and Atlanta and I think Detroit are and Denver are all down there. So I think it's possible that 1 or 2 of those teams win and the Giants move up to number 6. But realistically, I think that's their ceiling. They would have a lot of different options if they end up losing next week, or if they win and Washington also wins, they would still pick in the number 10 range, and they would still have a decent number of options there as well. But I've talked about, I went on this last week. They still have a ton of holes on the roster on both sides of the ball. I would prefer that they stockpile a couple of extra draft picks, but I don't think they have too many resources that they can sell off right now, because they're kind of in a middling position where they're trying to build around a quarterback on his rookie deal. But you see a very evident lack of talent overall on the roster.
Yeah, it's tough right now for the Giants because, I mean, they're in the limbo stage you talked about. But if they were to make the playoffs, they're definitely slated to play the Buccaneers, correct?
I'd have to double check that. I believe you're right. They've kind of resurged a bit after they bottomed out in that Saints game a few weeks back. I mean, hell, the Giants should have beaten them, frankly. That was the game Jones were kind of bottomed out. And then the Buccaneers have kind of come back and proved how dangerous they are. It was looking like if the Giants were going to win the NFC East, they would play either Seattle or the Rams, but that's changing. It's not going to be the Rams now. We know that. So I frankly, I don't think the Giants are in the spot where they're going to win a playoff game. I didn't think so before either. Yeah, they have definitely overachieved to an extent, especially on defense, but whatever team we would play if we do sneak into the playoffs next week would have already seen us. And I think that would be an advantage to them, even though the Giants kept both the Rams and Tampa Bay close and ended up beating Seattle. We're starting to see the reality check of how far away the Giants really are. The offensive line has regressed a lot the last couple weeks, which is disappointing, but not really surprising. And the offense is not going to win you a regular season game, much less a playoff game.
Yeah, that's well put. We don't have too much to talk about the Giants today. I mean, basically what took place is the same thing that's been happening all year, where they're up, they're down, and then now they go on their streak where they lose a bunch of games. The offensive line plays bad. But let's talk real quick about the Chicago Blackhawks and some news, what's happened to them. Kirby Dach, darn it, Bowman, you sent him to the World Juniors. He broke his hand. He's going to miss some part of the regular season. I actually saw a gruesome picture on Instagram where his hand's just completely out. It looks sick. But anyway, Kirby Dach's hurt. Alexander Nylander, no pun intended, hurt his meniscus in his knee. So he's going to miss some time too. I believe 4 to 6 months on him. So 2 young kids that are going to miss some time for the Blackhawks. Signed a depth center today because Dylan Strome still hasn't been signed. Carl Soderberg ended up signing with the Blackhawks. He gives them some depth on their team, which is much needed right now.
Well, let's focus on the main story here. That's Kirby Dach, without a question. The 3rd overall pick in the 2019 NHL draft. Look, I like the World Juniors a lot, but I don't like the idea of sending a player that you expect to contribute to your NHL roster in a few weeks, putting them in an exhibition game, a few weeks before the season, the regular season begins. That's like sending a dog to the vet right before he dies. It just doesn't make any sense. You're putting him at an unnecessary risk. And I think the Rangers were very smart to keep Lafreniere and Kakko away from the World Juniors. I'm on board with sending your prospects that are not going to be an immediate contributor for you to the World Juniors. So, take the Rangers example. Their second first-round pick behind Lafreniere this year is a guy named Braden Schneider. He is not going to make an immediate impact for the Rangers. And I'm on board with sending players like that to the World Juniors for two reasons. One, so they can, represent their flag a little bit, which is still a fun tournament to see. I like some of these international tournaments that hockey puts on. But two, another factor that you can put into this year, the AHL is either not going to have a season or it's going to be delayed. And especially for prospects that are in North America right now, they're not going to be playing any games at all until either the AHL starts up or something drastic changes. So you don't want these prospects to be sitting doing nothing or being healthy scratches. That's not going to be good for their development at all. The international prospects that are stashed somewhere in Europe right now, most of them are playing in the KHL or the SHL or whatever league they're in their respective countries. But I'm more on board if they're not expected to play for your team in the NHL season. It's similar in principle. It's for them to play in the World Juniors as it is for them to play in the professional league in Europe. But if you're expecting them to play for your NHL team here in the next 3 weeks, putting him at an unnecessary risk is just not a smart move. And we saw it backfire on the Blackhawks almost immediately.
Yeah, Kirby Doc, look here. Look here, Stan Bowman. This guy was good in the playoffs, the NHL playoffs. I'm not talking about the American Hockey League playoffs. I'm not talking about anything else. Kirby Doc, you could argue, was one of the best players on the Blackhawks roster during their short playoff stint where they won a series but ended up losing to Vegas. I mean, he was all over the place. He was a different player than you saw in the regular season. Regular season, he was a little bit up and down. You saw the flashes of developmental purposes. He's 19 years old. Still got to wait on him. But you got to the NHL playoffs after the restart, he was a new player. He was a new player out there. So to send him to the World Juniors, I understand it on two levels. One, like you said, representing the flag. Two, you're playing competitive hockey. You're not going to play competitive hockey with the Blackhawks. Yes, it's the NHL, but what I'm saying is it's a tournament style. You rally around your team. He's wearing a C. He's wearing a captain on Team Canada. That's huge for him, his honors and all that stuff. But at the same time, I see where you're coming from, where it doesn't help your team at all to send him over there. I just think it would have been nice to see some of these kids get great competitive hockey out of this, because that's something they're not going to see a lot, especially playoff style hockey or tournament style in the National Hockey League with the Blackhawks.
Well, the argument I would make for Doc, though, is that if he's going to get injured, you would at least, in a player development year for the Blackhawks, in all likelihood, want him to at least get injured in a game that means something to the team. This one doesn't. Now, I love the World Junior Tournament. I've been enjoying watching it. And I want to make it clear, they're not the only player that sent a highly drafted player to that tournament. Look at Tim Stützle, who was the third overall pick in this year's draft for Ottawa. He's playing for Germany right now. I know that he might be making an immediate impact. He might wait a year. We'll see what happens there. But he just signed his entry-level deal with Ottawa, and he's supposed to come and break camp with them. The Senators are also taking a risk. It's something that's unnecessary. We know it can backfire spectacularly here. On Chicago, it did. This is a player who did look much better in the bubble. I thought had a solid rookie season going, looked like he was starting to take that step, and now he's going to miss some significant time to begin the regular season. It's just not worth the risk. These guys who aren't going to be playing AHL games in the immediate future, or if they're playing in similar types of international games in Russia or Finland or whatever the situation is, I'm totally on board with getting them some important experience for their country there. I love the World Junior concept, but guys that are supposed to play immediately for your team, sending them there is just taking an unnecessary risk. I think the Rangers were wise to hold their two most recent high draft picks out of that tournament, so they didn't have to face a situation like this.
Yeah, and to touch on the Alexander Nylander for him as well, I mean, he would have had some sort of a role. You talk about developmental purposes. That's probably what he would have had. Maybe a third or fourth line for him just to get him some playing time. But now that's not going to happen. I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I saw what I saw out of him and I didn't like it. So he's not going to be playing for us. Soderberg, what do you like out of that signing? You think he gives them depth or something?
I mean, I want to hit on Nylander first here. So the Bulls, wrong Chicago team. The Blackhawks definitely wanted him to play. He ended up getting hurt in the bubble. And we finally found out several months later that it's a meniscus injury. He's going to miss most, if not all, of this upcoming season. And the Blackhawks were definitely hoping that this would be a year that he could take a bit of a leap. He's a former top 10 pick of the Sabres. And the Blackhawks made the bizarre decision to trade for him and trade Jokiharju for him, who was supposed to be an important part of that defense, which has been struggling. I thought that was a bizarre move at the time. They were trying to buy, they had the idea of buying low on Nylander, which I'm okay with that in theory, but they overpaid big time. They could have, spent a lot less to bring him in. Nylander, I think, had 28 points in 65 games last year. He's just not having that top 10 type of impact. And the best case scenario, let's say he takes that leap. He doesn't have top line center potential in my mind. He's a bottom six player currently who at best could transition to a middle six type of role. He is not a top six player to me. They invested a lot into him, and the fact that he's going to miss the season makes me think that his long-term outlook is pretty bleak.
Yeah, I didn't like that trade at all. I was a big Henry Jokiharju guy, but the thing with him, this was corresponding moves. You had a rookie the year before that, Dominic Cahoon. He played the left wing for them on the third line. He had a great year. They sent him to Pittsburgh for Oli Mata to replace Jokiharju, and they sent Jokiharju to Buffalo to get Nylander to replace Cahoon. So it was sort of like a transactional thing where they did the 2 for 2. If I'm not mistaken, I think they were traded on the same day as well. So it was sort of like a back and forth swap thing that they did there, and it didn't work for either team because now Mata's on the streets and one's on the long-term IR.
No doubt. And I mean, it's just some of the questionable management we've seen from Chicago in recent years. We can touch on Soderberg real quick. I think it's pretty clear he was brought in as insurance for Doc when he got injured, and also in case the Dylan Strome saga doesn't end anytime before the regular season starts. He's a decent player who's put up some decent numbers in Arizona. 1 year cheap contract. I don't have a problem with that. But if Doc is able to come back at some point during this shortened season, Soderberg's 35 years old. He's at the end of his career. I don't want it to be the type of situation where he takes away playing time from prospects. That's just not a good idea in the short or the long term for the team.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Poll question of the week. Will the Chicago Bears make the playoffs? Bears make the playoffs. That is the poll question of the week. You can find that on Twitter at the Big City Sports PD. But outside of that, that's going to wrap it up for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Click subscribe as always. Like the video, comment below. Just do all that fun stuff that we enjoy. So a lot of fan interaction. We want to see that going forward. But outside of that, we don't have anything else to bring up today. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.